Hello. Today is the fourth Sunday in Advent, and we have 4 candles lit on the Advent wreath. We're continuing Bartholomew's passage, and this last chapter will last all week long, and the whole chapter is titled Bartholomew's Passage, just like the book is. Today we'll read part 1. Nathan stood in the doorway. The light from the rabbi's lamp barely reached that far, leaving Nathan's face clouded in dim shadows, highlighted here and there with a splash of orange light. Was this a ghost? Bartholomew wondered. Or has my fasting made me see things which are not there? But then the rabbi stood slowly, looking like an old man who can no longer make his creaky bones do his bidding. Shuffling across the room, bony hand outstretched, he croaked, "Nathan! Nathan, is that you?" "Yes, Rabbi," came the soft reply. "It is I." Bartholomew's mind had frozen, could not think, could not even understand what it was doing. But some part of his mind told his legs to move, and a moment later he had run past the rabbi and jumped into Nathan's arms. Hugging his friend tighter than he had ever hugged anything, Bartholomew cried a long and happy cry. Nathan didn't say a word, but just let the boy release all his tears. Finally, Bartholomew's tears slowed enough, and his mind became aware enough to realize that the rabbi was there as well, one hand on Bartholomew's back and the other on Nathan's shoulder. His cheek, too, was wet with tears. When Nathan spoke, his voice seemed to Bartholomew to be filled with a weariness he'd never noticed in the man before. Nathan was always so cheerful and happy. Now his voice was filled with great sorrow. "It is good to be home again," he said at last. "My adventures have not been pleasant, nor is my news at all joyous." At this Bartholomew pulled back and looked his friend in the eye, fearing the worst about Jotham. "Our friend Silas is dead," Nathan said. "Killed by Decca." Bartholomew shuddered a bit and felt a familiar sadness fill his chest, but he had no more tears to cry. Besides, there was a piece of news he was still waiting for. "And our friend Jotham?" he asked, almost too afraid to hear the answer. At last Nathan smiled a bit. "Jotham is safe and well," he said. Then Nathan set them down at the rabbi's table and told them the whole story, how they had arrived at Silas's house, where they met a new friend, Hazra of Bethlehem, how Silas had taken them all to a meal at an inn, and how somehow Decca knew they would be in Jericho and had been waiting for them at the inn. Decca's men had attacked, and Nathan had asked Hazra to escape with Jotham to the home of Zechariah, a priest living in the hills. But Decca found Jotham there and kidnapped him. Zechariah's men tracked them down and killed most of Decca's men, but Decca and 2 others escaped. "What about Jotham?" the rabbi asked. "Jotham was in fine condition, though his spirit, of course, was upset. But I took him back to Jericho and put him on the caravan of a friend, and he is safely on his way to Jerusalem. My friends will not leave him until they find his family." When Nathan had finished his story, the rabbi spoke. "We have news as well," he said. "My assistant Nimrod was a traitor. He sold you and the boy to Decca. That's how Decca knew you were in Jericho." Nathan's mouth dropped open, and for the first time since Bartholomew had met him, his friend didn't know what to say. "Decca came back here looking for Jotham, and he killed Nimrod," the rabbi explained. There was a long silence, as Nathan just stared at the rabbi and thought about his words. Then he said, "It is not your fault, Rabbi." And Bartholomew wondered how Nathan knew what had so vexed the rabbi. I know this in my head, the rabbi answered, but my heart does not yet believe it. Nathan put his hand on the rabbi's. Believe it, my friend. I didn't like the man much myself, but I never would have thought him capable of such treachery. The rabbi nodded. The three talked through the night, although Bartholomew must have fallen asleep, because when he opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the rabbi's bed, sunlit from the window warming him. As they all walked into the prayer room for morning prayers, the whole of Qumran stared. The boys, not caring at all about the rules, surrounded Nathan and cheered and cried and talked. Finally, the rabbi restored order to the meeting. When he prayed, he thanked Jehovah for the return of Nathan, and he prayed for the soul of Silas and for the safety of Jotham's journey. As Bartholomew prayed in his own heart, he prayed that Jotham would find his family, that the Messiah would come soon, and that he would always be able to stay at Qumran with Nathan. After that, routine was restored to Qumran. The men and the boys went back to their jobs, and meals were served twice that day. Everything was normal, except that the rabbi was nowhere to be found. He didn't attend meals, and he said word that another monk was to lead the prayers. For the whole next day, the rabbi secluded himself in his room, refusing food. At night, Bartholomew could see a lamp burning in the rabbi's window, for as late as Bartholomew could stay awake, and he worried that the rabbi was again feeling guilty about Nimrod. But the next night, as all the men and boys stood at their places waiting for the evening meal to begin, the door opened and the rabbi walked in, seeming to Bartholomew a much younger man than he had been 2 nights before. In the silence that followed, the rabbi walked to the front of the room, to his place at the head table right across from Bartholomew, and stood quietly. Then he lifted his head and prayed, Jehovah, we thank you for that which you alone have provided. May it strengthen us for your service. Everyone said Selah out of habit, and then sat down and started passing the food. The rabbi remained standing, his hands folded behind his back. In these last days, he said slowly, I have been thinking much about Qumran. At that, he gave a hard look down the row of boys at the first table, and Bartholomew gulped. There are going to be some changes around here, the rabbi continued, and Bartholomew's heart sank, knowing what was about to happen. Consider this. Nathan lives, but Silas was killed. Is that fair? Why doesn't God just erase all evil from the world?